In the last couple of videos, we put together a set of 3 different config files, so 1 for the worker and 2 for our server. We're now going to flip back over to our command line and use kubectl apply to take those 3 new config files and apply them to our cluster. We're just going to make sure that there's no distinct error messages or that we didn't make any big typos or anything like that. Now, when we launch these different deployments, it's entirely possible that they're just going to crash and burn because we have not yet set up any environment variables to tell the worker or the server how to connect to Redis or Postgres, because we haven't even set those things up yet. So if the deployments or the pods that they are running just crash and burn horribly, that's totally fine. What we're doing right now is just checking to see if we have any typos or anything like that. So I'm going to flip over to my terminal. I'm going to make sure that I'm inside of my complex directory, and then I'm going to apply the entire k8s directory again. So remember, we do not need to pass in one file at a time. We can pass in a whole directory. When we apply that directory, we're also going to be reapplying the 2 client files that we had already applied previously, but that's totally okay, because remember, when Kubernetes gets a config file, it's going to look at the name of the object we're trying to create and its type. And if an object inside of our cluster already exists with the same name and the type, an additional object will not be created. Kubernetes is just going to try to update that existing object if there's any difference inside of the config file. So what I mean to say by all this is that whenever we make a change to our config file, or anytime that we create a new one or whatever it might be, we can pretty safely just take the entire k8s directory and apply everything in there and generally be okay. Now, there definitely are some side effects to that later on when we start adding in a couple more advanced objects that we're going to do much later in the course. But at least for right now, when we're only working with deployments and services, kind of free form, you can just throw everything inside of your config directory into kubectl and you're going to be okay. All right, so enough talking. We're going to do kubectl apply f k8s, like so. Now you'll notice that Kubernetes very correctly noticed that there are already 2 objects inside the cluster with the type and name of both these services right here, or both those objects, and the config associated with both of them has not been changed by any stretch of the imagination. So those are totally unchanged. However, the 3 other objects here are being created. Let's now do a kubectl get pods, and so we will see a list of all the different pods that have been created. It looks like we have the server and the worker running here successfully. So even though I kind of thought that they were going to crash and burn, it looks like they're doing okay. We can do a get deployments and see that we now have a total of 3 deployments. And then finally, we can do a get services and see that we have both the original client cluster IP service and the new server cluster IP service. Now, as a quick reminder, we could very quickly use the kubectl logs command to try to pull some logging information out of these new pods and kind of get a better sense of whether or not they are working correctly. We could also choose to reconfigure our Docker client to directly access the containers that are running the multi-server and the multi-worker images and pull logs that way. It's totally up to you. But just because it's a little bit easier, I'm going to pull logs using the kubectl CLI. So I'll first print out my list of pods again, and then I'll just take the name of one of these random one of the random pods right here. I saw the word deployment and confused myself for a second, but we're good. So I'm going to take the name right there, I'm going to copy it, and then I'll do a kubectl logs, and then the name like so. All right, so we can see that in fact, Node.js was executed, and that is our default npm start command. That's what we expect to see. But then very shortly after that, we saw a refuse to connect right here. Now the refuse to connect is coming directly from us trying to connect to Redis, but no copy of Redis is available. You'll notice that it did default to using port 5432. It only defaulted to that because the Redis library that we are using inside of that image defaults to use port 5432. So even though we didn't specify a port yet for this server to connect to, it just defaulted to 5432. And of course, when we eventually add in an environment variable to specify the port, even though it has a default, we're still going to make sure that we very directly and distinctly say it's supposed to be port 5432. All right, so it looks like everything is running as well as can be expected. So we're going to take another quick break right here. When we come back to the next section, we'll put together another set of config files for Redis, and then we'll eventually move on to Postgres as well. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.